Today we're going to talk about conflict. That's right, conflict. But before we get started, just take a moment and let that word settle in. Conflict. What does it call forth for you? What images, associations, thoughts, emotions, sensations? And as you sit with that, maybe some of these ideas that regularly encapsulate this idea of conflict came to mind. People often think of conflict as an expressed struggle, as an opposition between individuals or groups based on competing interests, identities, or attitudes, as a clash of goals or desires, as a kind of combat or disagreement, antagonism, aggressiveness, or any combination of obstacles that require some kind of attention. Conflict is a normal part of our everyday experiences. It's part of our communication and interactions. It happens regularly. Conflicts exist when people experience their differences as problems. So what do we mean by difference? Well, difference can be described as all of the ways in which we vary from one another, based on our ways of being in the world, our thoughts, our politics, our emotions, our values, all of it. Also, when it comes to these differences, each of us determines who and what we construct as different, and as what difference means to us. Differences shape how we treat each other through our words and actions. So when we think about conflict, some things that are helpful for us to consider is that conflict comes about as a manifestation of the inevitable differences that we have because of our uniqueness. Human differences are both created and managed through our everyday communication. Each of us has unique identities, histories, and experiences that shape how we think, feel, understand, and manage conflict. There are infinite ways of framing, interpreting, and responding to a conflict experience. How we do conflict may be quite different from others. There are some benefits to conflict. Conflict can help us make decisions. We can also gain understanding of another person's point of view. We can also discover undiscovered solutions or find new approaches to a problem. We can get feelings out, releasing some things, and maybe sometimes even finding closure, if that's the goal. We can also reaffirm relationships and help open conversations. Conflict can be both a teaching moment and a learning opportunity, depending on how we approach it. Author Dana Casperson, who wrote the book Changing the Conversation, The 17 Principles of Conflict Resolution, describes conflict as a knot. In other words, think of conflict this way. The strands of the yarn are in a complex relationship to one another. Trying to solve the problem by extracting one strand will likely increase the complexity of the knot and make it more difficult to undo. You need to understand the complex tangle of strands before you can discover a possible solution for undoing the knot. Put differently, we must look at the whole knot to untangle the strands, while also trying to discover why the knot was formed in the first place. In any conflict scenario, it's important to understand that we can't change how a communication happens. We don't have any control over the interaction because we have no control over what other people say or do or how they interpret a conflict scenario. All we can really control in any given communication and conflict interaction is how we react. In other words, we can't change how other people act. We often can't change the conflict situation, but we can change what we do within it. And some of the ways that we can work to do that is to help ourselves move out of a sense of certainty in our own rightness about a situation to a space of inquiry, where we can start to ask some important questions and develop curiosity about what's actually happening. I return now back to Dana Casperson's Changing the Conversation. Dana Casperson invites us to consider conflict as a place of possibility, as an opportunity to explore our creativity, but also to develop and cultivate curiosity. Casperson, in her text, talks about 17 principles of conflict resolution, which, when applied in our day-to-day lives, can make a huge difference in how we interact with people, especially if we want to move from a me-first approach of interacting with others to a we-first approach. So if we really want to make listening and speaking difficult in a conflict, here's what we'll do. We'll hear attack, and we won't be able to hear past it. We'll ignore any additional information that might be offered. We will attack the other person and create and support destructive or degenerative patterns, making the conflict become deeper and more challenging. We'll also provoke the person's worst self. In these moments, we might find that we confuse our own needs, interests, and strategies, ignoring our emotions or even acting them out destructively. We might assume that acknowledgement implies agreement and not even acknowledge another person's point of view. We might make suggestions or just focus on what we're going to say or how we're going to respond instead of listening. We may find ourselves really deeply judging people, trying to pass off our evaluations as if they're accurate observations of the situation. And finally, when we're making listening and speaking difficult, we may act on our assumptions without testing them. In a conflict scenario, we may also engage in strategies that ensure stagnation or destructive escalation by adopting a rigid stance, trying to avoid understanding other viewpoints, assuming that useful dialogue is impossible. We might also be ignoring our own contributions to the problem while we're also making things worse. We may be pinning the blame on someone, which is ultimately going to prevent a full understanding of the situation. And finally, we may prevent positive developments in a conflict situation by ignoring the conflict altogether, talking to the wrong people about the real problem. We may also avoid the real problem. We may assume that there are no good options for ever resolving this conflict, settling instead for unsatisfying solutions. We may make vague agreements or no agreements at all. And we may ignore the possibility of future conflict and have no plans for dealing with it. And as part of that, we may allow our activations to drive the conflict. Casperson offers some counter principles to those to help us do the opposite. So if we want to facilitate listening and speaking, it's helpful to not hear attack, to actually listen for the meaning behind the words. So in other words, how would I experience this difference if I hadn't heard attack? If we can resist the urge to attack, even in moments when we hear attack, we can avoid getting stuck in a cycle of attack, counterattack, attack, counterattack, attack, counterattack. Starting to unravel that knot by changing the conversation from the inside. Instead of talking to a person's worst self, what would happen if we actually assumed basic goodness or good intent and attempted to talk to the person's best self? If we were more clear on our own and others' needs, interests, and strategies and how to differentiate them, if we listened presently and fully, and dare I say even with loving attention, without making suggestions, without planning what we might say next. And if we differentiated between evaluation and observation, so that we can soften the grip that judgment might be holding on the moment. And when we have assumptions, which we all have and make, what if we tested them and let go of the ones that might prove to be false? So how do we do this? How do we change the conversation when we're in the middle of it? Well, developing curiosity is a good start, especially in a difficult situation, but that can be a real challenge. So if we can't get to a space of curiosity right away, at least as a first step, we might assume that useful dialogue is possible, even when it seems unlikely. If you're making something worse in a conflict scenario, stop. And finally, figure out what's happening, not whose fault it is. And to look for ways forward, a first step too is to acknowledge the conflict and talk to the right person about the real problem. Assume that you can come up with some other options for how you might interpret or experience this conflict, that there are options that are yet to be discovered, and that you can actually create solutions with other people that all might willingly support. And be explicit about agreements. If you get into a conflict and you learn something from it, you might make an agreement to not repeat the patterns that you established before. Be explicit about the agreements you make. Also be explicit when they change. And expect and plan for future conflict. If you know what activates you, then you can have a better sense of how to avoid reactivating yourself in a conflict scenario. You might turn to Tara Brach's RAIN model. Recognize R, what is happening. Allow whatever you're feeling to emerge, your thoughts, feelings, observations. Investigate. Here's that space where we can cultivate that curiosity, that curious attention, so that we can come into this nurturance with loving presence into the situation. Now, if that doesn't feel doable, maybe Amy Saltzman's Practicing Peace might be a better acronym. Peace. P. Pause when things start feeling difficult. Breathe in, exhale, sigh, groan. Ah. Acknowledge. Recognize what's happening. Recognize your role in what's happening. Allow whatever is coming up for you to happen. Choose. This point of choice. Choice points are important here. How we will respond. Not react, but respond. So that we can then engage after exploring the previous steps. We may have to repeat them. Another thing that I find really helpful in moments of conflict is from the book The 5 Keys to Mindful Communication by Susan Gillis Chapman. In this book, Chapman talks about the metaphor of a traffic light. A traffic light is a great way to notice where you are in the moment when a conflict arises. When you're in the red zone, as you might imagine, communication is pretty closed or shut down for you or whomever you're in conflict with. When you're in the red zone, it's a very much a me first stance, and it's difficult to move from red to green. So think of the green zone as quite the opposite of that. When you're in the green zone, communication is open, it's flowing, it's more of a we first stance. So where we really want to pay attention to is actually the yellow light. This is a state where we feel unsure, caught off guard, including moments when we're experiencing confusion, worry, doubt, fear. This zone represents these choice points. We can go towards a red or green light depending on the circumstances. So mind the yellow, because the yellow gives you lots of information about where you are in the moment. If you're in the red zone, this is a moment when you're going to make a conflict more memorable. You might say things that you regret. You might create additional conflicts. You might not be able to process with someone else the conflict that they're experiencing. And depending on the circumstance, whether it's one-on-one, in a group, circle setting, whatever it is, it can be helpful with a group to make some communication agreements. These communication agreements can really shape the dynamic of the group in important ways. For instance, some communication agreements might include, we commit to learning from one another. What does that look like in practice? We acknowledge that we have differences in a whole bunch of different realms of our experiences, from our identity categories, backgrounds, opinions, skills, interests, and values. But we recognize that these differences are valuable, even if they're uncomfortable. We respect these differences in order to create a more creative, aware, and understanding engagement among the group. We also just respect and value people for their unique perspectives of the world, their opinions, experiences, and differences in interpretation of an experience. One conflict can result in 10 different interpretations of it. And so we have to be cautious when we start to see our interpretation as the only interpretation of any event. So respecting and valuing different interpretations is really important. It can also be helpful to assume that others are doing the best that they can, working to speak to each other's best selves, and recognizing that we only ever have an incomplete and partial view of each other. In doing that, we can start to work towards challenging the idea rather than the person, especially if we value the relationship. And in a group context, if we find that we are dominating the rap, so to speak, we might find that we need to take a step back. And if we're feeling like our voice hasn't been able to contribute in the same way, we might try to take a step up. Because ultimately, in the end, by changing our communication, our world changes. These small everyday acts of just being curious in a moment when we would have previously been certain can create profound shifts in our relationships. Change comes in millions of tiny acts. These small acts, often unnoticeable, can multiply and have a ripple effect. In this way, each one of us has the power to change a conflict situation, one conversation at a time.